Natalie's small fingers gripped the edges of the worn folded photograph tighter as she watched the man with the dark tattoos from the corner of the restaurant.
Old sketches. She watched him gesture with a heavy gold ring, his movements sharp and deliberate, commanding the room without saying a word. The eyes, the way he holds his chin. Natalie's heart began racing as she realized the man everyone feared was the twin image of the ghost her mother cried over every night. She knew stepping into his light was dangerous, but as she smoothed out the crumpled $5 bill in her pocket, she understood that this was the moment she had been waiting for. 7-year-old Natalie clutched her mother's hand, wide eyes scanning the leather booths and polished brass of the city's most exclusive Italian bistro. Her small body, dressed in a simple light blue dress, was a stark contrast to the dark, custom-tailored suits of the men who sat in the shadows of the back corner. Kathy hadn't planned on bringing her daughter to her shift, but with only $12 left in her bank account and a final notice on the door, she couldn't afford a sitter. The single mother whispered urgent, trembling instructions as she smoothed her stained apron, praying the ruthless boss at table 4 wouldn't notice the extra presents. "Stay in the coat closet, Natalie. Don't make a sound, and I'll bring you a breadstick when the rush dies down," Kathy said, tucking her daughter into a small, dark space behind the heavy winter coats. She handed Natalie her worn backpack, unaware that her daughter was already reaching for the hiring fee she'd been saving for months.
The heavy, double-vaulted doors of L'Aerodata usually muffled the chaos of the city, but for Kathy, the silence inside was far more terrifying. She adjusted her apron with trembling fingers, her eyes darting toward the corner booth where Nunzio Tano sat. He was a man who commanded the air around him. His dark, meticulously styled hair and the sharp lines of his navy suit gave him the appearance of a king in a concrete empire. The tattoos creeping up his neck were a silent warning of the violence that had paid for his meal. Kathy had only $12 in her bank account and a final notice tucked into her purse. She had hidden her daughter Natalie in the cloak closet with strict instructions to stay invisible, but the universe seemed determined to strip Kathy of her last shred of security. Natalie didn't stay in the closet. She moved with a quiet, eerie confidence that ignored the armed enforcers standing like gargoyles near the kitchen. Her long, copper hair caught the amber light as she stepped into the open, a small, slender figure in a light blue dress that seemed to glow against the dark mahogany of the restaurant. In her hand, she clutched a crumpled, sweat-stained $5 bill, her entire world. Nunzio was mid-sentence, gesturing with a hand adorned with a heavy silver watch, when the girl reached his table. His enforcers moved to intercept, their hands drifting toward their jackets, but Nunzio raised a finger. He was caught in a moment of bewildered shock. No one approached him, no one looked him in the eye. Yet this child was leaning forward, her face a mask of unwavering determination. "I want to hire you," Natalie said, her voice small but piercingly clear in the quiet room. The enforcers froze. A few socialites at nearby tables turned, their faces pale with secondhand fear. Nunzio's mouth opened slightly, his brow furrowing as he stared at the tiny girl who had just interrupted a multi-million-dollar discussion. "You want to hire me?" Nunzio's voice was a low rumble, dangerous yet fascinated. "Do you even know who I am, Piccola?" "You're the man who finds people," Natalie replied. She didn't flinch. She slid the crumpled $5 bill across the white linen tablecloth, placing it right next to his vintage wine. "I saved this. It's all I have. I need you to find my daddy." Nunzio looked down at the pathetic scrap of paper, a ghost of a smirk forming on his lips, until Natalie reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn Polaroid photograph. She laid it face up on the table. The smirk died instantly. Nunzio's entire body went rigid. His breath hitched in his throat, and the commanding aura he wore like armor shattered. He stared at the man in the photo, the sharp jaw, the specific tilt of the head, the eyes that were identical to the girl's. It was a face he hadn't seen in 7 years. It was the face of the brother he had personally ordered to be erased. Nunzio looked from the photo to Natalie, his eyes wide and glazed with a sudden, haunting realization. He looked like he had seen a ghost, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city felt the ground slip out from beneath him. The silence in the restaurant was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to bend the light around the corner booth. Nunzio's hand trembled, a movement so slight it would have been invisible to anyone but Natalie, as he picked up the Polaroid. The chemical scent of the old film wafted up, but all he could see were the eyes. They were his eyes, the Tano eyes, staring back from a face he had tried to scrub from his soul. "Where did you get this?" Nunzio's voice was no longer a rumble. It was a jagged whisper, stripped of its authority. "My mommy has a box," Natalie said, her small voice steady, even as the enforcers closed in, their confusion turning into a tense secondary perimeter. "She says Daddy had to go away to keep the monsters from finding us. But I think you're stronger than the monsters." Nunzio didn't look up. He was tracing the edge of the photo, memories of a cold pier and a night of betrayal 7 years ago flooding back. He had sent Leo into the dark, believing his brother was a traitor to the family. He had heard the splash, seen the blood in the water, and lived with the hollow victory ever since. But the woman in the photo standing next to Leo wasn't a co-conspirator. She was the waitress currently frozen by the kitchen door, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Kathy," Nunzio said, his voice regaining a terrifying, razor-sharp focus. Kathy stumbled forward, her sensible work shoes clicking unevenly on the marble. She reached the table and pulled Natalie into her side, shielding the girl with her thin frame. "Please," she choked out, her eyes pleading with the man she knew only as the city's most dangerous predator. "She's just a child. She doesn't know. We have nothing, I swear." Nunzio stood up, his massive frame towering over them. The enforcers tensed, expecting a strike. But Nunzio did something that made the room gasp. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and carefully wrapped the $5 bill and the photograph together. "The contract is accepted," Nunzio announced, his gaze sweeping the room with a lethality that promised death to anyone who lingered. "Sir?" Marco stammered. "The meeting with the unions?" "Cancel it," Nunzio snapped, his hand moving to the small of Natalie's back, guiding her and Kathy toward the rear exit. "The Moretti family thinks they finished the Tano bloodline years ago. If they find out Leo left a daughter, they'll turn this city into a graveyard to get to her." As they moved into the cool night air of the alley, Nunzio looked down at the copper-haired girl. He saw the ghost of his brother in the set of her jaw. He had spent 7 years mourning a murder. He wouldn't spend another second allowing his brother's legacy to be hunted. The man who finds people had just found the only thing worth saving. The blacked-out SUVs tore through the quiet, rain-slicked streets of the suburbs, moving with a predatory urgency that made the evening air feel thick with static. Inside the lead vehicle, Nunzio sat in grim silence, his gaze fixed on the back of Natalie's head. She was staring out the window, her small reflection ghostly against the glass, still clutching the wrapped $5 bill as if it were a talisman. Kathy sat beside her, her knuckles white as she gripped the door handle, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. "We just need to grab the box," Kathy whispered, her voice trembling. "The one with Leo's journals and the rest of the photos. If the Moretti find it—" "They won't," Nunzio interrupted, his tone as cold as the steel of the weapon tucked into his shoulder holster. "We'll be in and out in 3 minutes." But as the convoy turned the final corner toward Kathy's modest apartment complex, the world exploded into a chaos of shattered glass and screaming metal. A silver sedan, lights extinguished, roared out from a side alley, its tires shrieking against the asphalt. Before Nunzio's driver could react, the passenger side windows of the sedan rolled down, revealing the rhythmic flashes of submachine guns. The sound was deafening, a staccato rhythm of lead punching through the brickwork of the apartment building and the reinforced glass of the SUVs. "Down, get down," Nunzio roared, throwing his heavy frame across the back seat to pin Natalie and Kathy to the floorboards. The apartment's front windows, where Kathy had spent the last 7 years trying to build a quiet life, disintegrated under the hail of gunfire. Dust and plaster rained down as the Moretti hit squad unleashed a relentless barrage, their intent clear. They weren't just looking for the girl, they were trying to erase the evidence of Leo Tano's survival before Nunzio could secure it. Natalie didn't scream. She lay pressed against the carpet of the car, her eyes wide, watching a stray bullet spark against the metal frame of the seat above her. She could hear the distinct metallic clink of spent shells hitting the pavement outside, a sound she recognized from the back of her father's old sketches. "They're using the heavy ones," Natalie whispered into Nunzio's chest, her voice eerily calm amidst the thunder of the shootout. Nunzio's blood ran cold. The secret wasn't just out. It had been compromised long before Natalie walked into the restaurant. He reached for his radio, his voice a low growl of command. "Counterfire. Sweep the sedan and move to the secondary extraction point. We don't go back for the box. The girl is the priority." As his enforcers returned fire, creating a wall of leaden protection, Nunzio looked down at the child in his arms. The Moretti family had declared war on a ghost, but they had forgotten that ghosts have heirs. The first hit had failed, but the hunt had only just begun. The blacked-out convoy pulled into the underground garage of a fortress-like estate tucked into the hills of the Santa Cruz Mountains. The air inside the bunker was cool and smelled of ozone, a stark contrast to the sulfurous heat of the gunfight they had just escaped. Nunzio stepped out of the SUV, his eyes sweeping the perimeter before he reached back to help Natalie. She stepped out, her blue dress dusted with plaster from the apartment, still clutching the $5 bill. "We're safe here," Nunzio said, though his voice lacked its usual ironclad certainty. He led them into a high-tech library where monitors displayed a dozen different angles of the forest outside. "Now, Kathy, talk. Why did the Morettis hit you the second we showed up? They've ignored you for 7 years. Kathy sat on a leather sofa, her hands shaking so violently she had to tuck them under her thighs. "Leo didn't just disappear, Nunzio. He didn't run because he was a coward. He ran because he found out about the Cortex project. The Morettis were laundering money through federal infrastructure. He wasn't a traitor to you. He was a threat to them." Nunzio went still, his hand hovering over a glass of bourbon. "I saw him go into the water. I saw the blood." "He had a vest and he had a plan," Kathy whispered, tears finally breaking through her resolve. "He reached out to me 6 months later. He couldn't come home, so he sent letters, coded ones." She reached into Natalie's worn backpack and pulled out a stack of envelopes, their edges frayed from years of secret reading. She laid them out on the mahogany table. To any observer, they were simple letters about the weather and missing his family. But Nunzio, trained in the old world ciphers of the Tano family, saw the underlying structure immediately. "The nursery rhymes," Nunzio breathed, leaning over the pages. "It's a map, Nunzio," Kathy said, her voice growing stronger. "He spent 7 years building a digital dead man switch. He knew if the Morettis ever found out about Natalie, he'd need a way to burn their entire empire down from the shadows. The key isn't in a box, it isn't in a bank." Natalie stepped forward, pointing a small finger at a drawing of a copper-colored bird at the bottom of the final letter. "Daddy told me the bird only sings when the sun is in the right place," she said softly. Nunzio stared at the drawing, then at the girl. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The letters weren't just messages, they were a tactical manual. Leo hadn't just left them a legacy of words, he had left them a weapon, and Natalie was the only one who knew how to fire it. The ghost hadn't just been hiding, he had been preparing for this exact night. The safe house was a fortress of glass and high-grade steel, but the silence within its walls felt fragile. Nunzio sat before a wall of monitors in the command center, his eyes bloodshot as he scrubbed through weeks of archived footage from the restaurant. His security team had already cleared the tapes, reporting nothing but the usual flow of high society diners and back alley deliveries. "There's nothing here, boss," Marco muttered, rubbing his face. "If there was a tail, they stayed in the Blandstats." Natalie stepped away from the corner where she had been quietly coloring with a red crayon. She approached the glowing screens, her small frame casting a long shadow against the data. She didn't look at the cars or the men in suits. Her eyes tracked the periphery, the tiny movements that the trained professionals had dismissed as background noise. "There," she said, pointing a small finger at the bottom left monitor. "The man with the blue hat. He's there on Tuesday." Nunzio leaned in, squinting at a grainy figure standing by a newspaper stand across from Larry Data. "That's just a local, Natalie. He's there every day." "No," Natalie whispered, her voice tightening with a conviction that made the hair on Nunzio's neck stand up. "On Tuesday, he ties his shoes with a double knot. On Wednesday, he carries his bag in his left hand. But look at his feet on Friday." She waited for the footage to cycle. "He doesn't have a limp on Friday, and he's wearing the same shoes as the man who used to watch me at the park, the man who always stood near the copper-colored bird statue." Nunzio felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He signaled Marco to zoom in on the man's footwear. Expensive, reinforced tactical boots disguised as common sneakers. As they tracked the figure through different camera angles over several weeks, the pattern emerged. The stranger wasn't just a passerby. He was a scout who changed his gait, his clothes, and his habits, but he couldn't change the rhythmic way he checked his watch every 10 minutes, a professional tick of the Moretti's top-tier surveillance units. He's been marking his shift changes, Nunzio realized, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He wasn't watching the restaurant. He was watching for Kathy's daughter. Natalie's gift for pattern recognition had done in seconds what his entire security apparatus hadn't managed in days. She saw the world not as a series of events, but as a map of inconsistencies. "He's the one who told the silver car where we were," Natalie said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "And he's the one who called the phone in the library just now." The desk phone in the corner of the room began to ring, a sharp, piercing sound that shattered the stillness. Nunzio didn't answer it. He looked at Natalie, seeing the terrifyingly sharp legacy of his brother shining through her eyes. The Morettis hadn't just sent a hit squad, they had planted a ghost in his own backyard, and only the child could see him.
The ringing of the desk phone stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. Nunzio didn't reach for the receiver. His eyes were locked on the security feed, his mind churning through Natalie's observation. The scout with the tactical boots hadn't just appeared, he had been positioned, and only 3 people in the Tano organization knew the exact timing of the restaurant's back alley shift changes. "Marco, get the girl and her mother to the sublevel," Nunzio commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "Boss?" Marco hesitated, his hand hovering near his holster. "We should wait for Silvio to arrive. He's bringing the encryption team." At the mention of Silvio, his longtime consigliere and oldest friend, Natalie's head tilted. She watched the way Silvio stepped out of the vehicle, his movements smooth and practiced. "He's doing the thing with his ring," Natalie whispered, her eyes narrowing. "The man in the blue hat did it too. Touch the gold, then the ear. Touch the gold, then the ear." Nunzio felt a cold sweat break across his neck. He watched the screen as Silvio adjusted his signet ring, then touched his earpiece. A rhythmic, subtle signal he had seen Silvio perform 1,000 times during high-stakes negotiations. He had always thought it was a nervous tick. Now, through Natalie's eyes, he saw it for what it was, a manual trigger for a localized transmitter. The realization was a jagged blade in his chest. Silvio hadn't just been selling information, he was choreographing the downfall of the Tano line to ignite a war that would leave him sitting on the throne. The heavy library doors groaned open, and Silvio stepped in, a sympathetic smile fixed on his face. "Nunzio, thank God you're safe. I heard about the apartment. We need to move the girl to the offshore site immediately." Nunzio turned slowly, his hands resting casually on the mahogany desk, inches from a concealed drawer. "You always were a man of tradition, Silvio. You like the old ways, the loyalty, the brotherhood?" Silvio's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "Because Natalie noticed something," Nunzio said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "She noticed that you and the Moretti scouts share the same habits, the same signals, the same blood on your hands." Silvio's hand froze halfway to his earpiece. The mask of the loyal advisor disintegrated, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a man who had already committed the murder in his mind. "A child's imagination, Nunzio. You're letting a brat's fairy tales compromise the family." "She's not telling fairy tales," Nunzio countered, his hand finally dipping into the drawer. "She's reading the patterns you were too arrogant to hide." Outside, the first distant crack of a sniper's rifle echoed through the hills. The betrayal was no longer a theory. The war Silvio had bought and paid for had arrived at the front door. The crash of the library's floor-to-ceiling windows was instantaneous, a symphony of splintering glass that signaled the arrival of the Moretti breach team. Silvio dived behind a heavy marble pedestal as the room dissolved into a hail of suppressed gunfire. Nunzio didn't hesitate. He lunged for Natalie, sweeping her small frame off the floor and shielding her with his own body as they slid behind the reinforced mahogany desk. "Stay small, Natalie. Don't let go of the bird," Nunzio roared over the thunderous staccato of automatic weapons. He could feel the desk vibrating against his spine as lead chewed into the wood. The estate was no longer a safe house. It was a kill box. Silvio's voice rose from across the room, jagged and mocking. "It didn't have to be this way, Nunzio. If you had just let the ghost stay dead, we could have shared the city. Now, you're just another relic waiting to be buried." Nunzio checked his magazine, his eyes meeting Kathy's. She was huddled in the knee well of the desk, her face ghostly pale, her arms wrapped around her daughter's legs. He saw the pure terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a spark of the same defiance that drove Leo. "Marco, suppress the balcony," Nunzio commanded into his radio, but the line returned only static. Silvio had jammed the frequencies. Through the gaps in the gunfire, Natalie pulled the $5 bill from her pocket, her eyes darting toward the shadows near the service entrance. "The man with the ring isn't looking at us," she whispered, her voice strangely calm against the roar of the battle. "He's looking at the clock. He's waiting for the chime." Nunzio's tactical mind snapped into place. Silvio wasn't trying to outshoot them. He was timing a secondary explosion. He looked at the grandfather clock in the hall. It was seconds away from the hour. "Everyone out, now!" Nunzio grabbed Natalie and Kathy, driving them toward the heavy steel door of the wine cellar. As they dived through the threshold, the library erupted.
The shockwave tossed them forward onto the cold stone floor, a searing bloom of heat following in its wake. Through the ringing in his ears, Nunzio saw Silvio emerge from the smoke, a pistol leveled at them, his face twisted in a mask of cold triumph. "Goodbye, Nunzio," Silvio sneered. But as he squeezed the trigger, a shadow flickered in the ventilation shaft above. A single precision shot rang out from the darkness, catching Silvio's shoulder and sending his weapon clattering across the stone. Natalie's eyes widened as she looked at the dark rafters. She didn't see a monster, she saw a rhythm she recognized. "The bird is singing," she breathed. Nunzio stood his ground, his gun trained on the wounded traitor, his heart hammering against his ribs. The warehouse was a tomb of smoke and fire, but for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't fighting alone. The smoke in the cellar was a living thing, twisting in the low light like a serpent, but the figure descending from the rafters moved through it without disturbing a single coil. Silvio scrambled backward on the stone floor, his face contorted in a mix of agony and pure primal terror. He stared at the man emerging from the shadows, a man wearing a tactical mask that mirrored the featureless white of a ghost, his movements possessing a fluid, lethal grace that Nunzio hadn't seen in 7 years. "Leo?" Nunzio's voice was a ragged whisper, the gun in his hand lowering by a fraction of an inch. The figure didn't speak. He stepped into the light of the flickering emergency strobes, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached up and pulled back the hood and mask. The face underneath was older, scarred by fire and time, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were the eyes from the Polaroid. They were the eyes currently staring back at him from Natalie's small, tear-streaked face. "I told you the bird would sing, Nunzio," Leo said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like it had been pulled from the bottom of the ocean. He didn't look at his brother first. His gaze fell on Kathy, who had collapsed against the wine racks, her breath hitching in a sob of disbelief. Then he looked at Natalie. The hardened soldier, a man who had survived a watery grave and 7 years of exile, visibly crumbled. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the chaos of the burning estate above them. "You found me, Nat," Leo whispered, his hand trembling as he reached out. Natalie didn't hesitate. She threw herself into his arms, her small blue dress a bright splash of color against his black tactical gear. "I hired the man with the tattoos, Nunzio," she sobbed into his chest. "I gave him my $5. Leo held her with a fierce, protective grip, his eyes shifting over her shoulder to meet Nunzio's. The tension between the brothers was a physical weight, 7 years of guilt and blood standing between them. "I never stopped watching Nunzio," Leo said. His tone hardened as he glanced at the wounded Silvio. "I saw the Morettis moving. I saw the traitor in your house. I was waiting for the right moment to burn it all down, but I didn't count on my daughter being the one to light the match." Nunzio felt a strange, hollowed-out peace settle over him. The ghost wasn't a haunt, he was a guardian. The brother he had mourned hadn't just been surviving. He had been the architect of their salvation, waiting in the dead zones of the empire he helped build. "The Morettis are still coming, Leo," Nunzio said, his voice regaining its iron. "Let them come," Leo replied, standing with Natalie still tucked firmly against his side. He pulled a second weapon from his belt and tossed it to Nunzio with the same effortless rhythm they had shared as children. "This time, we finished the story together." The sun broke over the Pacific horizon, painting the waves in shades of bruised purple and gold. The smoke from the estate had long since dissipated into the salt air, leaving behind a world that felt fundamentally altered. In a secluded terminal at a private airfield, the engines of a long-range jet whined softly, a metallic promise of a life thousands of miles away from the blood-soaked marble of the city. Nunzio Tano stood on the tarmac, his custom suit replaced by a simple, dark overcoat. He looked at Leo, whose presence still felt like a rift in reality, and Kathy, who was holding a set of passports with names they had never used before. They were no longer the Liams. They were a family whose history had been scrubbed clean by the very man who had once tried to end it. "The Moretti syndicate is in ruins, Leo," Nunzio said, the morning breeze whipping at his hair. "I've handed the evidence of the Cortex project to the people who can't be bought. By noon, there won't be enough of their family left to fill a courtroom." Leo nodded, a silent understanding passing between the brothers. The debt of 7 years couldn't be paid in words, but it had been settled in action. "And you, Nunzio, what happens to the Tano name?" Nunzio looked back at the city skyline. "The Tano name dies with the fire. I'm liquidating the assets. I'm tired of ruling a graveyard." He turned his attention to Natalie, who stood by the boarding stairs. She looked smaller in the vastness of the airfield, yet she held herself with the same uncanny poise that had brought her to his table. Nunzio reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small silk-wrapped bundle. He knelt before her, his knees clicking on the asphalt. With slow, deliberate movements, he unwrapped the silk to reveal the crumpled, sweat-stained $5 bill. He held it out to her, his expression softening into something remarkably human. "The contract is fulfilled, Natalie," Nunzio sighed, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "The target was found. The threat was neutralized. A professional doesn't take payment for a job that was a matter of family." Natalie looked at the bill, then at the man who had become her shield. She didn't take it immediately. She reached out and touched the heavy silver watch on his wrist, tracing the rhythmic ticking she had first heard in the restaurant. "Keep it," she whispered, "so you remember to always listen for the birds." Nunzio felt a sharp, clean ache in his chest. He folded the bill and tucked it into his pocket, right over his heart. "I'll listen," he promised. He watched as they ascended the stairs, the waitress, the ghost, and the girl who saw everything. As the hatch sealed shut, Nunzio Tano turned away from the plane. He had returned the girl her father, and in exchange, she had returned him his soul. The man who finds people had finally found a way home.